I want to welcome General Gray, a longtime colleague in these programs, who you'll hear from at the end. And now I'll turn the program over to Yona. I just might say one thing about we're going to hear from our speakers. Questions, is the traditional role of diplomacy changing? My hunch is it's just merely being added to, but we'll learn. So anyway, Yona.
Thank you very much, Don, for your continued support. I think if my count is right, it's almost 4 decades. And I think the rule of law is so critical, and the security through law. And now we're trying to combine actually diplomacy and a case study related to African security. We sent you an invitation, and I think the rationale or the purpose is that the various security challenges in Africa, you can have a very, very long list, all the way from climate change to natural disasters, to migration and terrorism, insurgency, wars, and many others, including even some WMD threats. So basically what I would like to do is to introduce briefly our distinguished speakers, and then to have 1 or 2 footnotes about our work related to diplomacy in Africa, and then we'll have the speakers make their remarks, and hopefully we will have some of the participants here in the special course at the ILI come and also engage in our discussion. So again, the first speaker is our colleague, Ambassador Charlie Ray, who is the former Assistant Secretary of POW Missing Personnel Affairs, and then the ambassador also in Cambodia and elsewhere, but particularly I think his work also in Zimbabwe and some other places in Africa is very useful. And he also served in the US Army for 20 years. The next speaker would be Ambassador retired Jimmy Coker, who is a former ambassador in Africa and Uganda, for example, and he would discuss some of his experiences and lessons. The third speaker, according to our agenda, is Ambassador retired Ed Marks, again, a colleague who worked with us, again, I think for at least 40 years on some of these issues. And he was ambassador to a number of countries in Africa. And when I met him, he was the deputy coordinator for counterterrorism at the State Department. The next speaker is Ambassador retired Stephen Degan, who is the former ambassador to a number of countries in the Pacific, and also served in a number of countries in Africa, such as South Africa and Kenya. And he would also share his experiences. Then we're going to be honored to welcome Honorable Akpan Lok, who is the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee for the Nigerian National Assembly. And he's going to deliver a message on behalf of Right Honorable Idris Ahmad Wase, who is Deputy Speaker of the House Nigerian National Assembly and Deputy Speaker of the Economic Community of West Africa. Last but not least, our colleague, General Al Gray, as Don Wallace indicated, who provided guidance and inspiration to all of us for many years. As everyone, I'm sure, knows, he was the 29th Commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps and is a senior fellow and chairman of the Board of Regents of the Potomac Institute. We also provided you with some information about his recent books, and I do hope that you will try to get a copy of them. Now, I think we would like to move on. First of all, I think one of the footnotes, I want to make sure that in terms of diplomacy, very humbly, in my particular case as a participant observer going all the way back to 1961, the UN, and I realized the role of diplomacy at that time. And in terms of security, we tried to focus attention on economic, social development. As the famous saying goes, if you give a man a fish, he will eat for the day. If you teach him how to fish, he will fish for the rest of his life. So I did research for a number of years and also produced some reports and books. Then the role of diplomacy most recently in cooperation with the American Academy of Diplomacy. And of course, Ambassador Ray and Ambassador Newman and Negroponte also participated in our event before. So we also produced some of the studies, and we have information on these reports. As far as Africa goes, I think it's important to stress that Africa matters for a very long time, decades. And in my short experience, back in the late 70s and 80s, especially 81, when many countries became independent, at the Center for Strategic Studies at Georgetown, we had a project to research on international violence. I think it's there on the screen, with Nigeria, the University of Ibadan, with Tunde Adeniran, who subsequently became a foreign minister of education in Nigeria. And then we're moving into ethnic, racial, religious rights, collective rights, and we established a journal dealing with minority and group rights. And we have articles there related to Africa, even the most recent one last month. And then we produced some other reports throughout the past number of years related to Africa, the Maghreb, the Sahel, West Africa, etc. So with that, I'm going to leave a map just to remind all of us some of the issues. We'll refer back to it later on. Ambassador Ray, would you please take the word?
Thank you, Yona. You know, current U.S. policy vis-a-vis the countries in Africa, at least from my outsider's view since 2012, appear to be focused primarily on countering extremist and terrorist groups and on competition with China for influence, although should we win that competition, I'm not sure what it is we plan to influence. And while these objectives might not be precisely aligned with the policy of many, if not most, of these countries, as the kids in my old Baltimore neighborhood used to say, it is what it is. It's not my objective to discuss the wisdom or appropriateness of the policy, because policy is decided by our politically elected leadership, hopefully after taking into account information from practitioners in the field. And it's the task of those practitioners to implement the policy in the most effective way possible. For now, I'd like to focus on only one of these policies, that of countering terrorism and managing the risks associated with carrying out that task. The U.S.-China competition in Africa is worthy of an extended discussion of its own, has its own risks, but they're risks of a different nature. I'd like to begin by saying that despite how it's portrayed in popular media, diplomacy is an inherently dangerous profession. Like soldiers, diplomats often go into hazardous places on behalf of the nation and its policy goals, but unlike soldiers, diplomats go unarmed. And when they make the ultimate sacrifice, are viewed not as heroes, but as victims who are soon forgotten by the next news cycle. Unfortunately, though, the problems of violent extremism and terrorism can't be solved using military means alone. There must be a significant diplomatic component to any solution. But employment of diplomacy also involves significant risk, both security risks and political risk. And in both, unfortunately, American diplomats are, in the words of four-time ambassador and former Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, Ann Woods Patterson, in an article she wrote in the September issue of the Foreign Service Journal, undermined in their ability to work effectively because of the rise of risk aversion at the U.S. Department of State, the reluctance to put people in harm's way under any circumstances has rendered us blind in most cases to what's happening on the ground. Back when I was a number 2 officer in our Consulate General in Chiang Mai, Thailand, we heard rumors of clashes between 2 of the major drug smuggling groups in the Golden Triangle. That's that area of Thailand, Laos, and Burma. Some foreign tourists had reported stray rounds from the fighting had struck some of the restaurants and night spots in one of the popular cities near the border with Burma. A dangerous situation like this usually required what was called at the time a travel warning, cautioning people to avoid travel to the area, but doing so based on unverified hearsay could have damaged our relations with Thailand and could have had a devastating impact on that country's tourism industry. With the approval of my Consul General and with the ambassador in Bangkok, I traveled to Mae Sot, a town on northern Thailand, in northern Thailand's Tak province, and the site of these alleged incidents. I visited a number of the establishments along the border, and in doing so, I learned that 2 of them had actually been struck by stray rounds. They still had the bullet holes in the walls to show me. But this incident happened over a month before my visit and had not repeated itself. As a result of this trip, we were able to issue a detailed travel advisory, which is a step below a warning. I think they're now called consular information sheets. And in the advisory, we described the potentially dangerous areas of town rather than advising people not to go to the town at all, much to the delight of the Thai and to the thousands of tourists who visit that area each year. This was but one of several forays I made to potentially risky areas of northern Thailand during my assignment. You know, I can't imagine an American diplomat today being allowed to do half of the things that I did on a weekly, monthly basis. I realized that, too, that in areas where terrorists are active, the danger is far greater than those I faced in Thailand. But if we're to be knowledgeable of local conditions, and if we're to continue to be able to influence events, even in these areas, a certain level of risk must be accepted. 1993 to 1996, I served as Deputy Chief of Mission at our embassy in Sierra Leone. During that time, large parts of the country were under the control of Foday Sanko's rebels. At the same time, the country was gearing up for elections to replace the military junta that had taken power in 1992. It was important that the Sierra Leonean military remain uninvolved in the political process, and through my connections with the young military men in the junta, I had convinced them that this was a fact and that they should support it, which they did. The head of the junta asked me, though, if I would be willing to take that message to all of their battalion and brigade commanders. The problem with that was that all but 4 of these gentlemen were in areas where they were in frequent, sometimes daily contact with the rebels. And large swaths of rebel-held territory lay between me and Freetown and their headquarters. I thought this was an important enough task to justify taking a certain amount of risk, and I convinced my ambassador, at the time, John Hirsch, that he should approve the trip. Took a little doing, but he finally gave in, and over a 3-day period, I flew from Freetown each day in an old Russian helicopter, flown by a South African mercenary pilot, and we visited 2 units a day, frequently flying over rebel-held territory, and sometimes with fresh bullet marks on the fuselage of the aircraft to prove it. Each day I spent a half day with each unit, and the mere fact that someone from the American Embassy cared enough to visit them ensured me a royal welcome, even though sometimes during my meetings and briefings you could hear small arms fire in the background. The Sierra Leoneans had their elections, and with only minor and easily controlled military misbehavior. In one case, a military unit marched out of the barracks, and a group of housewives with brooms and mop handles drove them back into the barracks, and they went. In addition, though, we had a more detailed and accurate picture of what was happening in the war between the rebels and the government, a better understanding of the morale and efficiency, or lack thereof, of the Sierra Leonean armed forces, and we had more respect from and more influence over all parties in Sierra Leone, except maybe the rebels. They weren't happy about it at all. This action alone, I have to say, was not the sole reason for the success of the elections. But subsequent events in the country after I departed at the end of my tour demonstrated the importance of being willing to go where the action is and to take calculated, managed risks in furthering policy goals. Diplomats buttoned up in fortress-like embassies with limited or no contact with the people of a country are at best only marginally effective, and at worst, a total waste of time, talent, and money. Wars aren't won by diplomacy, but peace cannot be achieved without it. Terrorists can be killed by military force, but addressing the root causes of terrorism require more than firepower. It requires knowledge of the environment that generated the extremist cause. And frankly, as a former military professional, I think I can say this with a certain degree of authority. This is beyond the skill of any military organization, and it is beyond the capability of diplomats who are confined to their fortified offices. Doing this, though, requires taking risks, not mindless risks, managed risk. The benefits of a task must be carefully weighed against the risks, and a way sought to accomplish the task while mitigating as much of the risk as possible. The only way that we completely avoid risk in a country is by not being in that country. And as my colleague, Ambassador Patterson, said in an article, we have to be there if we want to be effective and have a stake in the game. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Yona. Thanks for inviting me tonight. I'm Jimmy Colker. I'm sensitive to the fact that we're an all-male panel, and I'm looking forward to the discussion session to be sure that women's voices on questions of security are also heard. But in the meantime, I'll take advantage of my 30-year diplomatic career that included 5 posts and 14 years living in Africa, Mozambique, helped open a U.S. embassy in Zimbabwe, was #2 at the embassy in Botswana, and then ambassador in Burkina Faso, and after that, Uganda. But this was followed by another 12 years working full-time on global health issues such as AIDS and Ebola that are actually of direct relevance to African populations. And for the last 5 years of the Obama administration, I was Assistant Secretary for an office called Global Affairs that was the foreign ministry of our Ministry of Health. In looking at challenges and opportunities the continent in 2020 and beyond, I'm going to focus on two threats to Africa and the world that we're handling poorly now: insurgencies and outbreaks and epidemics. And my theme is that traditional military assets and responses are not well adapted to the security threats and conflicts that Africa faces. I want to amplify Ambassador Ray's point that diplomats and American officials have to be there. And I want to connect that to the threat we're facing right now in 2019, the Ebola outbreak in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Back in 2015, the United States worked with African governments to set up a new model for response to outbreaks which threaten to become global health emergencies. From the country offices in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone to its headquarters in Geneva, the World Health Organization failed and underperformed in its response to the Ebola outbreak of 2014-2015. And the new model reorganized WHO for rapid response and established memoranda of understanding with national public health agencies, in particular, the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC. And this was to be able to surge and scale up quickly. This system worked in the Zika emergency in 2016 and in the 2017 Ebola outbreak in the central part of DRC. Last year, however, when Ebola was detected in eastern regions of Congo, US government prohibited government employees, specifically including the CDC, from working in insecure areas, which included the provinces around Beni and Butembo, where the cases were multiplying despite WHO involvement and an experimental vaccine, which seems to work. That ban on direct CDC work on the ground has hampered the effort, raised levels of anxiety among Congolese and other responders, and contributed to the reality that the epidemic is 17 months later not under control. I'm on somewhat thin ice in this audience, but I'm going to predict with some confidence that over the next 20 years, Africa is going to lose more lives and more value of economic activity to outbreaks and epidemics than to terrorism. And so let's look at the response to Ebola from a security perspective. In Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, the outbreak started in opposition strongholds traditionally hostile to the government. In Guinea, the government's response was to send uniformed people, military and gendarmes, to, quote, bring the situation under control, but they had the opposite result. In an area to which the government paid no attention for years and the main source of income from smuggling, the arrival of these troops in uniform asking, quote, where have you been the past 21 days and who did you meet, ensured that the contact tracing program got off to a terrible start. I know there's a group here from Nigeria, a great group today, and in the Ebola context, yours is truly a good news story. The arrival of a Liberian traveler was appropriately handled, and while there were tragically some deaths, risks to the general public and Lagos especially were contained. But there's a backstory to that you may not know. Because of a strike in the public sector hospitals, the Liberian was taken from Lagos Airport to First Consultants, a leading private hospital. Within a couple of hours, a Nigerian-American doctor in my office in the Department of Health and Human Services was on the phone with the owner and head doctor at that hospital, whom he knew, and CDC immediately faxed a 2-page fact sheet on what to do if a suspected Ebola case arrives at your facility. It was only then that the patient was isolated, and the hospital rigorously followed the guidelines, saving dozens and probably thousands of lives. And the National Emergency Operations Center that was set up largely by the Gates Foundation to guide the polio eradication effort was mobilized to track the Ebola threat, centralizing data gathering and use, bringing government ministries, NGOs, donors, and the private sector together in a single operation. Public order was maintained because Nigeria was able to take full advantage of soft power tools that the United States helped provide. Global health security agenda, of which the United States has been a driving force, is in place to provide that same preparedness and those same platforms and networks to all WHO member countries. Over 100 nations have undergone joint external evaluations to review their progress and to deal with health emergencies through WHO's mandatory international health regulations. About half of those evaluations have led to national action plans to address health security, for which the US and other members of the G7, along with WHO, have pledged support. But turning back to DR Congo, what should people concerned about security be doing to help bring the Ebola outbreak under control? How could we manage the risk, our CDC experts who are eager to go, so that they can reinforce the surveillance, detection, and treatment in the most affected but dangerous areas? We may have some lessons from dealing with the insurgency in northern Uganda when I was ambassador there in the previous decade. When the national resistance movement took power in Uganda in 1986, numerous rebel movements fought the government in northern Uganda, which was home to the leaders Yoweri Museveni had just overthrown. By 2002, the only significant rebel force still active was the Lord's Resistance Army, which sustained itself by kidnapping young people from ethnic Acholi and Langi regions. The LRA's ruthless leader, Joseph Kony, was based in Sudan with protection from the Sudanese government as part of its conflict in South Sudan, where Uganda was supporting South Sudanese forces. I arrived in Uganda in 2002 after the Khartoum government had allowed the Ugandan military access to Sudanese territory to attack and root out the LRA at its main base. Kony and the LRA were surely tipped off. They weren't there when the attackers came. Ugandan Operation Iron Fist failed to capture Kony or his leadership, and thousands of LRA insurgents fled out of Sudan and into Uganda, where they terrorized the population. This civilian population, who spoke the same language as the terrorists, were systematically suspected and mistreated by the Ugandan People's Defense Force, National Army, who were not from that area. They were horribly paid and poorly led, and they had no strategy to deal with the rebel force or protect the population. So Uganda adopted the understandable but rarely successful strategy of forcing civilian population into protected villages and suspecting anyone outside the protected villages as an LRA terrorist. The weakness of that strategy was clear in 2003 when one of the villages, Barlongo, was sieged and occupied by the LRA. A handful of UPDF soldiers and local militia were overwhelmed, and by the time reinforcements arrived, over 200 village residents had been slaughtered. The need for better intelligence and use of intelligence in deployment and operation of the Ugandan forces was obvious, at least to me as the ambassador. So we set up an office staffed by less than a dozen US and Ugandan military intelligence personnel. By analyzing overhead imagery, communications intercepts, which the US could provide, and real-time reporting of civilian and military observers on the ground, which the Ugandans could provide, and communicating that analysis to competent UPDF commanders in the zone of operations, UPDF became a more effective, more risk-tolerant, and a more respected force. Many of the LRA leadership were killed or captured, and Kony himself was soon neutralized, fleeing Uganda for Sudan, Congo, and ultimately the Central African Republic. The protected villages were dismantled, the people went back to their homes and fields and shops, and economic development in northern Uganda is thriving. So defeating the LRA required security forces, but not a kinetic US troops on the front approach. Uganda needed smart tools to make its military platform operational. But now back to Congo and health security. Why aren't we developing the same intelligence fusion operation with the UN peacekeeping force in Eastern DRC, MONUSCO, to share unique American intelligence gathering assets on a real-time basis with the people running the Ebola response? If we did so, couldn't the Ebola responders have a much greater ability to manage the risks of saving lives in a conflict zone and get the A-team, the US Centers for Disease Control experts, onto the field where they're most needed? Both of these threats, Ebola in Congo, the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, were not threats to the United States. US security wasn't endangered. There was no transactional benefit, to go back to Ambassador Ray's description of some of the trends in US policy now. This wasn't a contest between the US and China or other great powers. But what was at stake were things that were very important to human security and to the security of Africa. And I think our ability to be able to engage smartly in those concerns can be translated throughout the continent. I'd love to talk about the applications in the Sahel and in Zimbabwe back in the 1980s. Thanks very much. Look forward to your questions.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the Inter-University Center for Terrorism Studies for inviting me today. As a long retired diplomat whose sell-by date is probably past, I don't get as much opportunity to pontificate as I would like. The classic definition of government is one involving the monopoly of force. Only the government can legitimately employ force, and force in the form of armies, police, legal system, enforceable government regulations. In other words, there's no substitute for a functioning state. Therefore, one of the most important political distinctions among countries concerns not only their form of government, but their degree of government. Is this truism about government which terrorist groups or movements, along with many other rebel or insurgent groups, challenge? Terrorism is really not some vaguely defined class of civilizations, but rather the clash between established governments and rural peripheries or insurgencies, whether they be Islamic, Western Russia, Chinese, or American. Political power is the central issue in an insurgency, and each side has this as its aim. Even small minority groups can wield significant influence when governments and civil society institutions are weak. While the insurgent attempts to overthrow or subvert an established government or authority, the counterinsurgent uses all the instruments of national power to support the government in enforcing the rule of law. What the insurgents teach us, therefore, is that everything is about governance. Therefore, counterinsurgency and counterterrorism involves the control application of national power in defense of the government. While this is an obvious and necessary first step, lasting success will often depend on the willingness of that government or any government under attack to undertake necessary political and economic changes. In our global world, however, few governments are in complete isolation, and their insurgency terrorist problem usually involves others, their neighbors as well as others, especially major countries like the United States with its global relationships and interests. Nevertheless, despite all its great know-how and enthusiasm, no outside actor can ever fully compensate for the lack of will and capacity or counterproductive behavior on the part of a targeted government. The United States counterterrorism policy in Africa has two broad program streams: military security assistance, a bundle of activities, and the civilian programs of the Department of State. The military assistance program involves a range of coordination and training programs such as foreign military financing and international military education and training. There are also programs designed to enhance African capabilities to respond to regional crises, especially in conjunction with the African Union, ECOWAS, and the United Nations peacekeeping operations. Finally, the United States military in the past 4 years has ramped up its special operation forces across Africa to more than 7,000 to counter growing terrorist threats from jihadist groups in the Sahel to Somalia. While the Defense Department conducts training programs for foreign military, the State Department Bureau of Counterterrorism and Countering Violent Extremism, what an incredibly bureaucratic name, focuses on local civilian law enforcement agencies and counterintelligence authorities to build the civilian capabilities of foreign governments threatened. So these programs include things like the Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program, Counterterrorism Partnership Funds, Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Initiative. However, there has been a tendency on the part of the United States government counterterrorism programs to focus on symptoms, not the cause, and specifically to concentrate on intelligence operations which lead to successful kinetic actions. Also important and relevant for the US government's terrorist programs in Africa is that these two sets of CT programs are implemented by two separate bureaucracies. The United States government deploys parallel diplomatic or intergovernmental systems. Two, the traditional diplomatic structure of the Department of State and embassies, and the regional military combatant commands. Each conducts CT programs. While they are supposedly coordinated in pursuit of the whole of government concept, all of us who have government experience know that such coordination has built-in tensions and inevitable controversies. At the heart of the controversy was and is the long-term running struggle for control between the state and defense departments. Whether the State Department will retain its historic jurisdiction over security aid, or whether the Pentagon, which recently has received much more autonomy and resources from Congress, will eclipse the State Department and take greater responsibility for engagement with allied nations overseas. In other words, who speaks for the U.S. government? The Pentagon has complained for years that the State Department, which lacks a sufficient staff to oversee aid programs, is not as fast or nimble as it might be in processing aid proposals. Robust and flexible funding for such programs, defense officials say, will not only help them to combat global terrorism, but will compensate for a shrinking U.S. military force. Others argue that an expansion in Pentagon control of security assistance impairs diplomatic efforts and furthers the growing militarization of foreign policy. This struggle was exacerbated in Africa by the establishment of AFRICOM. As Gordon Adams, a former White House budget official, noted, this seemingly arcane bureaucratic competition has wide-reaching effects. Who owns the ball matters here because it colors the way the U.S. engages overseas. If American engagement wears a uniform, that's one form of interaction. If it involves the ambassador and his or her people doing governance work, it's a different set of missions, and there's a hugely different perception. As another commentator, General Stanley O'Cristo, put it, you can kill or capture enemy leaders. You can set back their organizations. But I found that these kinds of blows were never decisive. The problem is that they give you the illusion of activity and the illusion of progress. In other words, the tactical often tends to override strategic concerns and objectives. Proponents of security assistance claim that it's a cost-effective tool for advancing U.S. interests on the continent, while being welcomed by African partners. Critics, on the other hand, contend that social security assistance has been at best ineffective or marginal, leading to brief but unsustainable improvements in security, or at worst detrimental by inflaming intercommunal tensions, undermining civil-military relations, or contributing to human rights abuses. A recent RAND Corporation report found that security sector assistance has a mixed record in Africa. In the Cold War, security assistance appears to have increased the incidence of civil wars. In the post-Cold War period, security assistance appears to have had little or no net effect on political violence. However, one good part is that in peacekeeping contexts, social security assistance appears to have reduced the incidence of civil wars, terrorism, and state repression. Regardless of this essentially internal U.S. government argument, there is an elephant in the room, the general level of competence of African governments. With some notable exceptions, many African governments effectively govern only their capital city. Much of their countryside is essentially anarchic, in the hands of anti-government forces of varying kinds. And there are governments as well as rebel movements which employ terrorism as a regular tactic. This returns us to the basic question of the importance of root causes of insurgency and terrorism. And if incompetent local governments are central to the problem, what does this mean for outside actors like the United States? One answer is nation building. However, the credibility of that approach has been badly damaged by recent experience. As some skeptics pointed out and were ignored, you cannot do nation building in somebody else's country. What is left is a concentration on diplomacy, in the classic full meaning of the term, not the occasional reference to what's done before you go to war or something done after military action, but the whole of government sense whereby military policy and action is a subset or instrument of diplomacy, as Causeways tried to teach us. Yes, counterterrorism policy must draw on all available tools to succeed. This includes combining CT programs with development and humanitarian assistance when necessary to target environments that enable violent extremism to flourish. But U.S. foreign development assistance can only effectively support counterterrorism efforts when supporting reasonably competent local governance. There's a currently fashionable theory about the most desirable United States government foreign policy called offshore balancing. Stripped of its think tank terminology, this means accepting that foreign governments exist, that they are the prime actors in their territories, and the U.S. government can most successfully deploy influence and protect its interests by accepting this reality. And that includes combating terrorism as a component of a coherent diplomacy pursuing a realistic foreign policy. Or as Kwame Nkrumah once said, seek you first the political kingdom. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I think one of the benefits of being the last speaker is that I have also the opportunity to draw from the comments of the previous speakers. I'd like to add, though, from the outset that one of the things that's really important about diplomacy, the Department of State, is the fact that as you go throughout your career, you have the opportunity to work with your fellow ambassadors at various ranks. So although only a portion of my career was in the Bureau of African Affairs, which I met Ambassador Kolker, actually the bulk of my work with Ambassador Ray was in the Bureau of East Asian Pacific Affairs, and with Ambassador Marks, when we both served at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. Right? But one of the things that was not really mentioned in the beginning was that, yes, I served in Nairobi, Kenya from 1995-98, but I left Nairobi just 3.5 weeks before the August 7th, 1998 bombings. I knew everyone in the embassy, but what was striking about that situation is we have to remember that we were not attacked by Kenyans. All right. In fact, while I was in Nairobi during that period, those who wanted to demonstrate against President Moi's government always chose to demonstrate in front of the American embassy, simply because the Kenyan army would use a lighter grade of tear gas. All right. But that said, I know firsthand of the effects of terrorism in Africa. But one of the things that we did not mention in the introduction is that I spent the last 5 years of my career at National Defense University, where I served as Deputy Commandant of the Eisenhower School for National Security and Resource Strategy. And prior to that, I was Vice Chancellor of the College for International Security Affairs, which focuses primarily on counterterrorism issues. And unlike most schools, senior service schools at National Defense University, the majority of the students at the College of International Security Affairs were actually international students, international fellows. And so I was fortunate and able to convince AFRICOM to allow the students at CISA, which is what we call it, to use their annual year-end exercise as, in fact, part of the red team for helping to develop AFRICOM's approaches in Africa. What's important about that is that when we start thinking about diplomacy in Africa, we have to start thinking about our African partners, not just the approach of the United States, because partnership, diplomacy, countering violent extremism all fail unless you have reliable partners. But to have reliable partners, you also have to focus on the future of Africa and its needs in order to understand the requirements of the countries that we want to work with. And when we understand what those requirements are, then we have to be able to match the appropriate programs and resources to meet those requirements. I say that because you cannot have a successful diplomacy without resources and programs. And to Ambassador Marx's point, I think we have to be realistic and understand that the Department of State has already been eclipsed when it comes to assistance in Africa. The most important U.S. entity for assistance to Africa is actually the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, otherwise known as DSCA. Most Ambassador Kogler talked about the importance of pandemic control, but most of us tend to overlook the fact that it was DSCA that provided a $1.5 billion pass through USAID and then on to AFRICOM, essentially to handle the Ebola crisis. All right. I think we also have to understand that as we go forward, while Ambassador Marx mentioned that this Department of State has in its Counterterrorism Bureau the Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program. INL has some programs mostly focusing on drug control, that for the foreseeable future, the security cooperation programs of the United States, funded largely by DSCA through the combatant commands, will make up the bulk of U.S. assistance overseas. And so as a result, if we understand how DSCA works and the role it plays not only in security cooperation, but also an important part of this is foreign military sales, all right, we can begin to start building a structure of cooperation between the United States and Africa that would come up with some type of reasonable framework for success. So let's talk about what Africa is going to need in combating terrorism. Well, let's start with secure communications, all right? Secure broadband, for example. Law enforcement cooperation, facial recognition technology, wildlife protection, anti-poaching. I mentioned law enforcement cooperation, infrastructure security, right? And of course, more cooperation, humanitarian assistance, and disaster response. Again, why is HADR important? Simply because the tools for HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster response, are very much interoperable with other security assets and tools. So we have to begin to look at how we use these resources that are available in partnership with African countries. Moreover, we still can't forget that as economic growth dramatically increases in Africa, we have to continue to address the problem of income inequality in Africa. All right. If we were going to have any structures that address the problem of countering violent extremism, then we have to also address the growing problem of income inequality. We can't separate the two. So again, for the foreseeable future, when we start talking about diplomacy in Africa, when we start talking about countering violent extremism, we have to start first with what are the needs and requirements of our African partners, not what are the needs and requirements of our African partners today, but what are they going to be in 2050, right? We can't think in terms of all we need to do is provide assistance to African countries who can provide expeditionary forces for us to work in Northern Africa or on the Horn of Africa, but in fact, we have to be prepared for growing urban crises, and the result of the movement from rural to urban areas in Africa, and how that impacts, again, questions of income inequality, but most importantly, how do we counter violent extremism? Once we have an understanding of what those future problems are going to be, and how our African partners are going to address those partners, then we can forge together a reasonable diplomatic strategy to counter terrorism. And with that, I'll sit down. Thank you.
A very good afternoon to us all, and I thank you for this opportunity. On a lighter note of recent, the younger generation has been advocating for political space to be able to share ideas. But I don't think that I would be advocating for a space in a table like this, because of it's the advocacy we had was not for younger ones to sit in a table of former diplomats and they are wondering what they are going to say next after they have spoken. But their job has been made easy when you are representing an individual, and then the script had already been given to you, so you are not bothering about what you're going to say. But before I am here representing the Deputy Speaker of the House of Representatives of Nigeria and the Deputy Speaker of the ECOWAS Parliament, so I have a script already written and I'm going to deliver his speech. But before then, let me speak to a few of the issues that has been raised, starting from Ambassador Charles Ray. When you spoke about being out on the field, trying to get to hear and know what is happening, it speaks to exactly what has happened with the United States Embassy in Nigeria specifically. And I want to use this opportunity to commend the work of Ambassador Stuart Semington, and then the last Consul General John Bray, in their engagement in the just concluded national elections in the country. It would have been something else, but they went out there, they came out, they went to challenging situations and circumstances and were able to evoke confidence of the people. And when they spoke, from the security agencies to the active players, they were able to get the people to act in a way that they ought to have acted. Because most of the challenges that we have in insecurity arises from power sharing situations or situations of elections or situations of electoral processes. It would now, if it is not well managed, it blossoms into crisis and then leads to insecurity situations. So I commend the United States government and what they did during the last elections as represented by the embassy there. Ambassador Jimmy Coker spoke about the Ebola, the fight for Ebola, and I want to place on record the support of USAID in the fight for Ebola in Nigeria, and then the support that the CDC gave, and even in the challenges of combating HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis, because these are equally issues of security concerns. When you have disease and then they spread, it's going to lead to loss of human lives and some measure of conflict in trying to struggle for the available health resources, maybe like the hospitals or the facilities. So it brings conflict, and then in a larger scale, it leads to larger issues of security. So I want to commend the USAID on that. Then Ambassador Edward Marks spoke on the fact that you cannot go to do nation building in another person's country. And that is why I'm happy that my brothers are here from Africa, that we have heard it loud and clear, and that we know that as those entrusted with the responsibility of managing the public lives of the people, we have a greater role to play. And that role is to make sure that we have transparent government, government free of corruption, and then government that is for the people, so that we can attract the confidence of the people, and with the support of international agency or other countries, we can build a better country and reduce the issues of insecurity. And Ambassador Stephen Magan spoke about one key issue, which is at the bottom of a little bit of the crisis we have within Africa on insecurity. Let me take the case of Boko Haram in Nigeria, for instance. You find out that there's an economic undertone. So the issue of income inequality is very key in fighting instability. These are a few words, my own position. That's not the position of the Deputy Speaker, which I'm going to read very soon. But you've talked about diplomacy. How long can we go with diplomacy? where you have like, I love this map, where this is where we could have, you call the arc of instability, whether it is Islamic Maghreb in the northern region or whether it's Al-Shabaab out there. Issues of, would you engage diplomacy in situations that leads to crime? For example, you are engaging those who have taken terrorists, who have taken people hostages, and they are asking you to release some of their members who are already in security detentions in exchange of some persons or some aid workers who are in their domain, or some people that they've been able to kidnap or abduct. How do you employ that? How do you balance that in ensuring security and then doing diplomacy? Those are a few concerns and a few questions from my own personal perspective. And now the speech of the Deputy Speaker. I wish to thank the organizers of this roundtable panel discussion for the opportunity accorded me to make a few remarks on this occasion. Security as a human need is very crucial to the existence and stability of every society. According to the Hobbesian theory of social contract, the very existence of organized societies and government was for the purpose of securing human lives and properties. Before then, life was short, barbaric, and brutish. However, it is imperative to point out that the concept of security is ever evolving. Once synonymous with the defense of territory from external attack, the requirements of security today have come to embrace the protection of communities and individuals from internal violence. We must also broaden our view of what is meant by peace and security. Peace in this case means much more than the absence of war. Human security can no longer be understood in purely military terms. Rather, it must encompass emphasis, economic development, social justice, environmental protection, democratization, disarmament, and respect for human rights and the rule of law. My own definition gleaned from the above is the absence of insecurity and or threat, improved standard to quality of human life, economically, socially, politically, with access to resources and overall inclusion in policy-making processes of government. Some causes of security concerns in Africa are poverty, lack or absence of rule of law, weak governance stroke institutions, unemployment, youth restiveness, climate change, corruption, conflict, etc. Resultant effect of these issues are increased cases of corruption and corrupt practices with adverse effect on the economy and the overall standard of living in any given state. Increased cases of violent conflicts, through clashes, through banditry, and kidnapping, occasioned by the need for survival of the deprived or disenfranchised population. Mass migration and increased cases of internal and external displacement as a result of scarce resources occasioned by climate change, conflict, insurgencies, and extremism. Non-inclusion in the political, social, and economic policy-making processes of government by the younger generation ultimately leads to political apathy or decreased participation. With climate change, natural disasters have increased. Flooding, drought, desertification, especially in the Lake Chad region, which is in turn creating new refugee population and catalyzing internal conflict and strife. Lack of political and security mechanism to address rising cases of conflict. And now opportunities 2020 and beyond. A, increased regional and sub-regional cooperation for adapting best practices to suit security concerns. The merchants of insecurity and violence have become more complex, fluid, and organic. There's therefore the need to upgrade our security policies to focus on networking and cooperation amongst regional and sub-regional government and people. B, harnessing youth potentials. Africa is a young continent with the median age at just 19 years. The protruding youth population could become an important economic boost to the region. Alternatively, it could further increase the risk of instability and violence if young people are deprived of quality education, stable employment, and a political voice. It's also critical to promote an education system fit for the purpose, with a strong focus on entrepreneurship and technology to optimize opportunities and reframe narratives. Next is catalyzing rapid economic growth. Economic growth on the continent is forecast to continue at healthy average rate of 5 to 7% per annum. But there is an urgent need to ensure it raises living standards more broadly to tackle extreme poverty and inequality across the continent. The rapid growth and the uneven spread of foreign investment around cities and certain sectors is cementing this. The infrastructure needs remain high, and the importance of fully internalizing the importance and needs of cities and the built environment more critical. Putting into place policies for inclusive growth, investment in education and health, and providing public services to the poorest would improve social cohesion and harmony in African societies and ensure the economic allure of Africa as an area of investment for regional as well as external partners. D, sustainable management of resources to avoid irresponsible use and exploitation. Africa is blessed with abundant natural resources and land, but they have often been exploited irresponsibly. This has damaged the environment, widened wealth inequality, and fueled resentment and conflict. Increasingly serious problems with water distribution and population growth will put greater pressure on the need to modernize subsistence agriculture, while climate change effect will aggravate the problems. Drought, floods, or poor harvest may create new refugee populations and increase strains over shared resources. Much would depend on how African countries mobilize to harness their human and natural resources and put them to efficient use in order to avert the aggravation of an already volatile continent. On a final note, let me state that although this discussion may be focused on African security concerns, let me point out that Africa is a part of more holistic global security architecture, which also has its challenges. Therefore, opportunities for addressing these concerns will not be complete unless there is a synergistic collaboration amongst global players to jointly address them. Once again, thank you for the opportunity.
Questions or comments?
I was just suggesting to Professor Alexander, we have time for questions and answers before we get the general. I think, Yona, you should preside. And please feel free to raise your hands, and Milton, and someone has, wonderful, that microphone. I know you'll speak into it in the prescribed way.
The Honorable Mr. Luke, I'd like to thank you for your remarks. And I'd like to address a question to you. You're, of course, aware of the Treaty of Ebola, which went into force in July 2009. And it has been ratified by over 40 African states. It establishes an African nuclear weapon-free zone. My question is, has any thought been given to extending this treaty, which applies only to nuclear weapons, assuring that countries in Africa are free of them? And that's not hypothetical. One country in Africa has a history of having nuclear weapons, which is South Africa, and it got rid of them in the 80s when the apartheid regime went out. So, like the Middle East, there is a state in the Middle East which also has nuclear weapons. So that's a serious issue. Very interestingly, there's one country in Africa, Egypt, which has also been pushing very hard for something additional to just a nuclear weapons-free zone, but a weapons of mass destruction-free zone. Now my question to you is, has Africa given some thought to extending the Treaty of Ebola to a weapons of mass destruction free zone, including nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. Biological weapons, the spread of biological disease, biological organ disease in the Congo is something you're very familiar with. So these elements could form the basis of a biological weapon. So it's a real issue. And the question is, has Africa given any consideration to extending this concept of the treaty of to not only include nuclear weapons, but chemical and biological weapons? Of course, with the appropriate verification regime for each. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Microphone, please, to the. Yes, there we go.
Sorry, sir, I did not get your full name.
My name is Milton Honig. I didn't give it.
Okay. Thank you. And like I said, I am here on a representative capacity. And again, I am not authorized to speak for my country as it is. I came as a participant on this course, but Africa as a continent, we are a people building towards world peace. We need world peace, and we are not comfortable with if we are joining our voices to condemn the uranium enrichment by other countries and in building nuclear weapons. I don't see why we as a continent would only ask for other countries to do the things that we're not prepared to do. So as a continent, we are for world peace, we are for diplomacy, and then we will not encourage, this is on a general term now, we will not encourage the building and amassing of nuclear enrichment for weapon of mass destruction. But as I said before, I am here on a representative capacity. I would only speak as to the level of which I am permitted to speak on this topic. But on a personal engagement, I think I would make my own personal view known, but not the position of my country or the deputy speaker, which I'm representing in this case. But we are working towards ensuring world peace, and then we would not encourage the amassing of weapons of mass destruction.
Are there ambassadors, U.S. ambassadors? You would like to make a comment on that?
Never even heard of it.
Well, I guess I can just make a couple of comments, particularly since I served in apartheid South Africa, and so I understand fully what the intent of South Africa's weapons program was, and it was also one of the few countries that intended to use nuclear weapons internally, but of course that's not all South Africa. However, the question of nuclear, I think, raises a broader issue of what are Africa's energy requirements are going to be in this century and beyond. If in fact we look at what Africa's needs are going to be when it comes to energy, can we just say it suffice that renewable energy will be sufficient? Actually, the answer to that is no. Wind is not going to work. Solar is not going to work. If in fact what we're really thinking about is dramatic economic growth. Dramatic economic growth in Africa requires that we don't take nuclear energy off the table. Okay. So, and you don't take nuclear energy off the table, all right, and you put things on the table such as continued use of liquid natural gas, other fossil fuels. You go back to my original point that one of the key areas that we have to focus on in dealing with counterterrorism policy in Africa is protecting African infrastructure. All right. So the question so much isn't whether or not African countries will use weapons of mass destruction against each other. The real question is, what are the viable sources of energy to fuel African economies? Nuclear may be one of those. You can't take it off the table. Right? Expanded use of fossil fuels can't be taken off the table. Right? While we all promote renewable energy, but if we're talking about addressing, the issues of rapid urbanization, mobilization of the population, moving from different transportation forms, you're going to have to address these critical issues. So I think that nuclear is just part of that, but nuclear has to be seen not only in this peaceful development, but also how are we going to protect Africa's infrastructure if we're going to sustain economic growth going into the 21st century.
Anyone else? Okay, please identify yourself. Can you get the mic?
Thank you. My name is Ben Pandeto. I'm from Kenya. And I just want to appreciate some statements that were made on the recognition that it wasn't the Kenyans that did the US. And two, to recognize that nobody can do nation building for you. And I think, of course, I'm not an expert in diplomacy and terrorism, but I think this is also the issue of Kenya's involvement in the Somalian government issues. To what extent then can Kenya influence a stable government in Somalia? And this brings me to the point that I think the issue of terrorism, my country, Kenya, from my perspective, is two-way. One is proximity to Somalia, proximity to countries that are unstable. And therefore, Kenya is then considered unstable. Of course, in recent times, we've had some concerns, but really it's about proximity. So I don't know whether this is politically correct, but I would think it's also relation. It's been said that, again, the 1998 was as a result of the relationship between Kenya and the US. And that, again, Kenya is therefore considered unstable because of a terrorism act that happened within our capital. And therefore, for me, the way I see it is that the role of diplomacy in these two issues is the kind of support then that what we call our friends give us in terms of how to secure Kenya, how to secure this country from getting hit as a result of the proximity and, of course, the relationship with some of this country. I think that's the discussion. To what extent then does, for example, the US supports Kenya in counterterrorism?
The ambassadors, Ambassador Mark.
If we're using this, what's this all about?
That
That's
requires.
the report. It's
The
not
Kenya
the-
Somali situation is a perfect example of what I'm trying to talk about. Kenya has its problem. All countries have their problems. But Kenya's terrorism problem is imported from a neighbor which does not have a competent government and therefore is subject to unrivaled, uninhibited violence. So the question of diplomacy is whose diplomacy? Somalia, which can't have one because it doesn't have a government. Kenya or the United States. Diplomacy is mostly a misunderstood term. If you ask most Americans what diplomacy is, they think it means good manners, speaking well, and not causing trouble. Diplomacy is the way a foreign government, the way any government implements its foreign policy. So it's a process, but the substance is what's the foreign policy. Somalia doesn't have a foreign policy because it doesn't have a government. Kenya has a foreign policy because it has a government and it's dealing with important neighborly problems. Other governments, such as the United States, to the degree we have relationships with the governments of the region, can figure out how we can help. If we are interested in security in Kenya as in the region, we have to figure out what we can do, but we have to do it with the Kenyan government. We can't do it. So we have to figure out in what ways, politically, economically, assistance, can we do, understanding there are severe, inevitable, unalterable limits. Because the prime player is the government of Kenya and the ungoverned situation in Somalia.
Okay, please, next year.
I think mine is just a comment. It's actually arising from my colleague's comment that even as Kenya was entered into Somalia, somehow neutralized the insurgency that is in that particular country. The Somali government has already taken Kenya to the National Criminal Court, the National Court over the boundary between the waters between Somali and the Kenya. And if you look at how the Somali government is claiming that boundary, it is like about a line that is almost touching the border, and it is coming close to the coast of Kenya. And that waters were actually strategic to the fight against Al-Shabaab, because Kenya and partner countries were actually trying to intervene along the coast of the Somali coast. So I think even as African countries are trying to apply, we find that the same Somali government is not working together, because he's now taking one of the partner countries to international court for this boundary issue. And if that boundary is actually given to Somali, it can be a challenge trying to patrol the coast of Somali in terms of movement of illegal groups and arms to actually arm the Al-Shabaab. So it's a big challenge arising out of it is actually like imagine. Therefore, I don't know what is your view concerning that particular issue that is now being created by the Somali government itself, has been unable to contain the insurgency in that particular country.
Okay, can I ask you, both of you from Kenya, a question? I think this is the 6th anniversary of the attack on the mall. The question is, in addition to the role of the government, since we're talking about soft targets, what is the role of the society in terms of preparing themselves for the next attack, so to speak, or to prevent the next attack? I'm talking about the role of education, for example, or the role of religion, because the government in general cannot be effective without the support of the population. So my question is, after these experiences, and of course going all the way back with the Al-Qaeda attacks, what do you think you accomplished in Kenya in terms of the role of the civic society? Over there.
I think arising out of the recent attack, one of the things that has become clear is, or one of the issues that now everybody is thinking about, is where are your children? You're responsible for your children who have disappeared. You cannot explain their disappearance. The requirement now, or at least the move now, is that reports. If you cannot find your children or relatives, the imagination then is that they must be involved or might have been recruited into some terrorism related activity. And therefore, right now, the most present civic duty is to report absence for a long period of relatives. Of course, the other issue now is everybody is alert, security. You will find people with reports quite easily suspicious activities happening within your neighborhood and within your office and within among. At least now people are more alert in terms of security.
Anybody else? Yeah, we have in the back over there. Where? Okay, right.
I'll give you the microphone.
Hi, thank you all for speaking. My name is Madeline. I work with the Stimson Center on our Sahel work, especially looking at herder-farmer conflict. And I have two questions, but I'll be brief. First, looking at this issue of governance, even if we're talking about protecting infrastructure, the government is supposed to do that. We're talking about fighting income inequality. That's a service the government is supposed to provide. So, and I want to talk specifically about a particular facet of weak governance, and that's corruption, which can cause both autocratic governments, that the security implications are clear in Sudan and DRC. It can also cause weak governance as money is pilfered before it has time, and governments can't pay their military salary, pay their teachers' salaries. Does the U.S. government, this is a question for everyone, does the U.S. government have the tools it needs to address corruption as it pertains to a security threat in the region? The second question is just to ask about interstate conflict. If you foresee, especially the Kenya-Somalia dispute over sea waters. I recently returned from a trip to Bamako where they were saying that one of the biggest challenges of the G5 Sahel force is that Mali won't share information with Mauritania. You know, that there's still is this interstate competition. Do you foresee that growing as a security threat in Africa, or mainly remain stable that has that matter with it?
Okay.
Take the microphone.
And you were very enthusiastic.
All right, I'll go first. The answer to your first question is no. We do not have any significant role, authority, power, influence to control corruption in somebody else's country. Second question depends upon, if you're talking about the United States, what you view as the role of the United States in the world. The sheriff, the global hegemon, the leader of coalition, a partner with others up to certain degrees. So first define what you want the United States, what you think the United States role can be, which requires the acquiescence, forced or not, of other governments. So define who we are first, then we describe what role we can play in interstate relations among other countries.
Yeah, can I combine that with the response also to the good comments from Kenya? I think Americans sometimes don't realize the sacrifices that African countries are making population in absorbing millions of refugees. Kenya has had Somali refugees there for decades. There are a tremendous number of people, and the US end of that bargain was we support some organization in the camps, but we also take refugees for resettlement. And the fact that we've reneged on our part of the bargain puts further pressure on certainly Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, who are been very generous in housing refugees. But the number of displaced people and refugees now in West Africa is enormous, and these pressures to migrate to Europe and so on are in part a result that traditional channels through which refugees are resettled are being closed by our own decision. Second, we are outsourcing our stability in Somalia to East African countries, especially Ethiopia, but also Uganda and Kenya are the ones on the front lines against al-Shabaab. And I think the US, sometimes when you ask what support does Kenya get for that kind of security, I think again, we sometimes forget that we're not doing this because we had a horrible experience in Somalia. And the situation is relatively calm because the neighboring states are involved. But neighboring states all have interests, and this border question is interesting too, because the African Union was established in part, as I understand it, to say, okay, we're not going to touch the colonial borders. And then everyone's touching colonial borders. Morocco's annexing people. South Sudan is seceding. The whole Horn of Africa, the borders are a little bit vague. Ethiopia, Somalia disputes have been ongoing. And so this question, again, one reason Mali and Mauritania don't trust each other is that there are irredentist groups, there are groups across borders who really are threats to the other country, and that those borders are not respected. So I don't have the answer to that, but I think that we have to realize that we're in a new world in which I don't think the African Union and other groups have stepped up. ECOWAS has done a good job on many fronts. I think is the strongest of the organizations from the security point of view, but really haven't dealt with these questions of why don't we trust each other, and why are these borders not secure in that. So but you know, Nairobi has suffered, Kampala had the attack by Al-Shabaab in the World Cup watching. These people are dying because of their involvement in Somalia, doing work that the United States has large part encouraged them to do, and I think your reminder is important for us.
I think your first question deserves a slightly fuller answer, although I agree with the no. It's not that we lack the tools. I mean, we have laws and regulations regarding corruption, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, for example. The problem is not in the tools, it's in how we use or do not use them for any number of reasons. Sometimes domestic political concerns inhibit our ability to address the issue of corruption in certain places. Other foreign policy issues, and I would, we need a country for some particular reason, and so in order to push that policy, we turn a blind eye to certain corrupt practices. And the other is an image issue, and I'll not use corruption, although, I mean, let's say every country has a certain level of non-standard behavior. It makes it very difficult for a diplomat to go into a foreign interlocutor and start to lecture them on cleaning up their act if CNN just did a big story on some really corrupt action back home. So, you know, I guess what I'm trying to get at there is I don't know how effective an external actor can be cleaning up corruption in some. It's like nation building. You can't build another person's nation. You also can't clean it up for them because one man's corruption is another man's facilitation. And as an example, my wife's Korean. I lived in Korea for a long time. And when I first went to Korea, it was probably, I would say conservatively, it was the most corrupt country in Asia. And I say that with all reverence because I love the Koreans. When it developed a solid middle class and when the military was no longer running the government and when a uniquely Korean form of democracy came into effect, a lot of the old corrupt practices were outlawed. For example, I lived in Seoul, and in Seoul, unless you were a foreigner with connections, you had to pay $2,000 under the table to get your telephone connection in less than 6 months. After 1989, I think it was, when Koreans were allowed to travel abroad freely, they were arresting and jailing phone company employees for still asking for that money. But what's worse is a lot of Koreans, even though they weren't required to pay it anymore, were still paying it because it did speed things up and they were accustomed to doing it. So, you know, and how do you deal with that? You have to let the people in that society come to terms with what level of corruption is unsustainable and how will they pull themselves back? Right? You cannot go in and preach to people about cleaning up, because you can't afford to have a spot on your apron if you do.
I'll just add a word or two, and I'm no expert on this. First, of course, we all make the same point, but you cannot. Nation building comes from inside. I mean, one thing that has clearly changed in most nations, the countries themselves are aware of corruption. They're the ones who are most disturbed. I just recently spoke to the Chief Justice of the country. He's utterly distressed, a totally honest, competent man, by what's happening in his country. And the more there is of that, the better. Secondly, South Africa may be the perfect example, but Ramaphosa is a lot different from Zuma. An internal change, and he's taking on the guptocracy or whatever it was. Other point, I don't entirely agree with Ed Mark said. I'm not a diplomat, I'm a law professor, and there's an enormous amount of interest in ridding countries of corruption from the outside. All the agencies, the World Bank, etc. I know Jeffrey's left. We constantly push for the improvement of public procurement regimes, and procurement is a great source of corruption. So I think there's more happening than you know, but it may not be within the normal remit of an ambassador, or it may be, in fact. So I think one should be really much more optimistic, particularly in Africa, by the way. I mean, look at the young lady, young-ish, from Kenya. I was in Africa many, many years ago, in East Africa. Let me tell you, the change in awareness, intelligence, and spunk is enormous in most African countries. And we shouldn't just think about Ebola and the one or two obviously corrupt countries. I think the changes are just great.
We can have a special seminar on that, and if we can resolve the organized crime, issue, maybe we can make some advances in the corruption in the country, but that's something else. Please, Mr. Ambassador, I know that you want to respond. Can you get? Yeah. Yeah.
Response here.
Mr. Ambassador, you have to hold it horizontal and pointing at your mouth.
Oh, like this. Yeah.
And you talk into it.
All right. Of course, that hides my face from the camera, doesn't it? But anyway. But I think one of the things we have to do in dealing with corruption is to understand that it's not so much corruption, but in Africa, particularly in dealing with the private sector, there's a rules of the game approach, as opposed to American companies are dealing with a rules-based approach. So, for example, the BUILD Act, which was adopted, passed this year, created the International Financial Development Corporation, makes available $60 billion in underwriting of equity investment for American companies trying to not just go to Africa, but elsewhere. Obviously, the BUILD Act was created to counter Chinese investment. But that said, even with the expansion of equity underwriting, American companies are still hesitant to do business in Africa. As for example, my second tour as a Foreign Service officer, Morrison Knudsen built the Ingashaba diversion in the Congo River. Well, then it was the Zaire River. There are very, very few large development projects run by American companies in Africa. Okay. And so what has happened, this gets back to my other point, that the space for American engagement in Africa still keeps drifting over to security cooperation, simply because that's a government to government space, right? It's not a private sector space, right? And so therefore, in dealing in that space, what we found is that there's been an expansion of the various entities within Africa that we can deal with now under the aegis of security cooperation. It's called defense institution building. So, for instance, a security cooperation officer in the embassy can now work with the Ministry of the Interior, right? Or even the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, right? So we keep expanding this definition of defense institution in order to be able to increase the influence we can have on the security cooperation simply because of the rules-based approach in Africa. We can no longer have the ability to engage effectively in the private sector.
And in addition to this, while insisting on centrality of governments and local customs, one factor that makes a difference leaning for and against the communities of culture, of corruption, is whether a country, particularly a fairly new country, developing country, has what we call the oil curse. One of the great advantages that Kenya has is it doesn't have an oil curse. There are no major large minerals, there are no oil, there's none of that. It has, in fact, a variegated culture and economy, which involves lots of people in it. But countries, and you know who you are, which have primarily as a major economic benefit a single mineral lend itself open because single mineral developments lend itself to corruption inside to small groups, creating kleptocracies instead of governments, and to interested outside groups who find they have someone to deal with, and you can get a bargain situation which completely bypasses government.
Thank you very much. General Gray, would you like to come? We have one more question. Okay. I cannot hear you. The microphone on?
Thank you for this beautiful forum to discuss the future of Africa. They sent from Africa. And the head of the African American Forum, also I work with them to live in the state. We are the largest Muslim NGO working in Africa. Following up with the question of Professor when you ask about the role of the religions, I think we are lacking this element, very important element, which is the religious diplomacy. You see the right side also of the story, we have Morocco now, that they are training imams from Mali and from some countries on the side, which will help the youth and the young generation to understand the religion itself. Why I'm saying this? Because in 2007, when I was in the border of Mali and Algeria, opening a school there, and then doing some development work, I was talking to somebody there, and he told me, we don't need school for girls here. We need you to bring us the Quran. All what we need is Quran. Women doesn't have any role here. At that time, this raised the flag for me. And I went to Bamako. I met with the director of the public affairs at the embassy here. I told them there's an issue here in 2000. This is 2007. I said we should tackle this issue by doing more development work in that region. Make the schools, give the people what to do. Return back 2010, nothing was done. And then end of 2010, 2011, terrorists were there. I'm saying this because we should not forget this role of two elements here. One, we have to invest in humans. I was talking last week with somebody from International Religious Freedom Office at State Department about this. Should we have to emphasize on this? Because we can talk about democracy for a long time. We have some countries in Africa, they have democratic institutions. But do we have democracy? I don't think so. We can talk about the level of corruption. But if we don't go to the root of the problem, which is the civil society itself, we need to fix this problem with civil society. Then we get the civil society to work. They need us, who are living in the West, to give them what they need as tools. Thank you.
Thank you very much. General Gray. Can you kindly get the mic to General Gray? Or would you like to come up here? Oh, Michael. Oh, it's not.
I'm pretty sure I'll come to you. I'd like to talk to
And I was raising my working level. I'm sorry.
Good job.
The policy is a lot of as remarks citizens program. People. But there are practical challenges with this one. First of all, dealing with Congress, which I do, which I state money, funding has been cut back in the last couple of years. The State Department helped fund the Justice Department program, training investigators, prosecutors, the able phone countries, the parliamentary system, which sometimes there's a problem in finding team members who can work effectively in helping countries improve their laws and regulation in the parliamentary framework. There's also an element of just plain old-fashioned diplomacy. As the ambassadors know, the contacts of both at the ambassadorial level, but the political officer, the economic officer, is very important. And unfortunately, the parliaments have decimated almost at many levels. I was talking to somebody who just recently retired from this.
Yes.
And she was supposed to take military. There are cases where political officers who are doing all that 20 years. Who then turned over terrorists to us when they found into their territory. I don't want to leave the country where these specific cases. I also like to comment on the corruption issue, which is very important. Just a little anecdote. When I was in Congo, I had a long discussion with the financial officer who was involved with training Congress officers. Who said those who were sent to the Belgian equivalent of West Point turned out to be very good officers. They did a tour of duty in NATO and excellent. But when they went back home since 6 months, they fell in a pattern of nepotism, partly because many families sent their pool of resources to sort of as the brightest boys at school, and then once they became prominent, they expected to help the other families. It's a little bit of Ambassador Coker talked about the different attitudes and cultures. That's something we call nepotism, and I think they consider looking at this family. But I think the basic takeaway is there's no magic solution. The training has to be done. Some of these programs have to be repeated. 3 or 4 cycles. We've done a lot for Tanzania, for example, and some of the funding from there. And I think it really takes support from Congress and hopefully some outlets, the public, to keep these training programs.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And I want to, first of all, thank our distinguished panel of ambassadors and leaders. I thought this was just a great conversation this afternoon, and thank all of you for being here as well and for your many, many comments. It's very clear that these challenges are very complicated, and there is no easy answer, and there's no single answer. You talk about corruption and that type of thing. Corruption is a way of life in many countries, including ours. And corruption can only be lessened, if you will, by a continuous effort on the part of people who don't want corruption to continue to try to do things right. And this kind of thing takes a long time. It can't necessarily get up on a big white horse and preach about this and that. When you deal with other nations, whether it's in Africa or anywhere else in the world, what does the United States really hope to achieve? In my humble opinion, the United States hopes to achieve global stability wherever possible, so that freedom and commerce and economics and all the other things that make up life in general in any country, all those things can flourish. This is not easy. Some people think it's impossible. I don't agree with that. Anything is possible if you stick with it long enough. But it takes a lot of understanding. It takes an understanding of a nation. You have to understand the mores, the cultures, the languages, the people. You have to understand what a country in Africa wants, what the people want, how they are. And this is difficult. And we in the United States are not necessarily very good at that. We have to get better at that. Our ambassadors, of course, are experts at that, but many of us are not. We talk about anti-terrorism and counterterrorism. I mention this every time. Terrorism is a tactic. It's not a way of life, it's a tactic. And it's a thing that people do and use because they want to capitalize on fear. And so how do you translate that? How do you get rid of a sufficient amount of fear so that it's no longer effective? That's a difficult challenge, but it's one that everybody has to meet, and everybody has to consider. And so you don't defeat a tactic, and we shouldn't have a war against the tactic. We should have an effort against what's best for the country and for the people. I think I got a kick out of Ambassador Ray's initial comments about Thailand. I know that he looks older than me because of his distinguished gray hair, but I'm really about 20 years older than him. I was in the Burmese Triangle in 1956 doing some work with the Thai police against the same type of thing that you were interested in, and it wasn't any different then. We had all the same kind of challenges in life. But one thing that I want to mention, really all of our distinguished speakers alluded to directly or indirectly, we have to take some risks if we're going to solve problems. And we're very risk averse. And we got to get rid of that kind of idea. You got to get out there. You got to get with the people. You got to find out what the people in Nigeria or Kenya, what they want, if you're going to help them. And that takes a risk. And so there's no profession here for anybody who's risk averse. And if it were up to me, I'd take all the risk averse people and shoot them in the leg and watch them roll around the ground. But then people don't listen to me. But that's right. So this is not easy. But in summary, I think we got to go forward. We've got to understand that this is a total systems and strategic approach. It's not a military type of thing at all. It's a total strategic approach. It's geoeconomics, it's statecraft, it's listening to people, and after all, you never learn anything while you're talking. And we're not very good at listening to other people, other countries, other nations, other desires. So with all that, I remain the eternal optimist. I'm going to see to it that all of you are brought back on active duty, and so that we can take advantage of your talent. Thank you all very much.
Al Gray is a Marine. I think probably the answer for America is we should all be Marines, quite frankly. Ken,
distinguished ambassadors, members of the diplomatic corps, sure, colleagues, the think tank, thank you for being here. And you will also notice that this talk coincided with the ILI Legislative Strategic Management course. And we thought that it would be important for the legislative bodies to listen to your talk today, and that the interaction was wonderful. So if I could also just introduce some of our delegations. Of course, we have the Nigerian National Assembly present. We also have the Kenya Parliament present. We've got the Saudi Public Transportation Authority, who's working on their legislation right now in the delegation. And we also have the Singapore Attorney General's Chambers. And this talk also coincided with the welcome reception. So I hope that you will use this opportunity, enjoy some food, some wine, and interact with our participants. Thank you, ambassadors.
I was in the EU from 2011 to 2000. I know that because at first I was but I was going to I was sent off to Timor-Leste, and Timor-Leste, I was told no, you're not retiring, you're coming back with which actually is very useful because I graduated from my kids.
Let me buy you a beer, Charlie.
I
was thank you very, very much. Thank you for inviting me. I have been out of touch.
Follow up with your work and also